Okay, I'm not really sure how to explain this whole thing. I'm not even that wild to talk about it. But I need to be heard out one way or another. What I'm about to say, I've never brought it up since it all happened. Until now, that is. My name is Dr. Vern Carter. I'm a geologist and a paleontologist, and I study some of the oldest remains of life on Earth. I had started my work in the southwestern US, but the majority of my studies have taken place elsewhere, namely Russia and Australia. The fossil life I've studied ranges from some of the earliest forms of plants and animals to smaller microbial fossils in forms such as stromatolites, dome-like structures of cyanobacteria. Some time ago, I was offered to oversee a month-long excavation at a quarry in Antarctica, nestled in between the summits of Dome Fuji and Dome Argus. The rocks of the East Antarctica Shield are up to 4 billion years old, making them among the oldest known rocks on Earth. The Earth itself is estimated to be 4.6 billion years old, which meant there was a chance that we could perhaps find some of the oldest fossil evidence of primitive life ever to exist in these formations. With about 99% of the surface of Antarctica covered in a permanent blanket of snow and ice, there is still much that remains unknown about the continent's geological history. However, the area we would be taking in just so happened to be the absolute coldest known place on the planet. Temperatures here have recorded to drop to as low as minus 148 degrees Fahrenheit, far too cold for any living thing to possibly withstand. Luckily, the majority of the 2 months would be spent inside the facility built on top of the quarry, keeping us safe from the deathly weather outside. 2 other people would be accompanying me on this excavation, colleagues of mine, Dr. Eric Sampson and Alan Campbell. I had worked together with the 2 of them previously on excavations in Australia and in Greenland. I met up with Alan in Dunedin, New Zealand, where we departed by boat for Antarctica. Eric had already been stationed at the quarry a few days prior, awaiting our arrival. The voyage there lasted roughly 2 days, the air and the water getting colder as we neared our destination. Upon arrival in the Ross Sea, we were greeted to the sight of massive icebergs in the water, towering over our vessel. Mount Erebus, the southernmost active volcano in the world, soon came into view from Ross Island. At its shore was a vast rookery of Adelie penguins, one of the 3 nesting colonies Ross Island is home to. Before long, we were docked at the coast, where we boarded onto a plane. As we took off, the vast frozen landscape was seen as far as the horizon. Miles of snow and ice seemed to stretch out forever. 6 hours had passed, and we finally arrived at the facility. The plane landed on a stretch of flat land that was part of the East Antarctic Plateau. In the middle of the endless white backdrop was the research facility that was built on top of the quarry we were to excavate at. Once we exited the plane, Eric was outside, coming over to greet us. "Good to see you too. Both of you guys must be exhausted after all that." "That's putting it mildly," responding to his comment. "Still not good with long trips as much as ever, Vern?" "How's the quarry? Found anything yet?" I asked out of curiosity, just as eager as me to see results. "About that, you guys are in for quite the shock. Started chipping at the rocks about 2 days ago. Found some microbes. Haven't dated them yet, but these could be quite ancient." "Show us then. It shouldn't take long to get their age." "Of course, right this way." Alan and I followed him through the front entrance of the building. Once inside, we made our way through a circular hallway down to the quarry. The 3 of us arrived at 2 large doors at the end of the hallway and went through to see the large terraces that had been dug into the earth, at least 40 feet deep. "This is where we'll be digging. I've only just scratched the surface, quite literally, I may add." "What about the microbe fossils?" I asked Eric, curious to what he's uncovered. "Ah, yes, let's head on over to the lab." We went back through the hallway, following Eric to the lab where the fossil was held. The 3 of us then entered through a door into a small room, where in the center stood a table with a microscope, and under it was a thin slice of rock. "Well, have a look." Heeding Eric's words, I proceeded to have a look through the lens. I was able to get a look at the small, single-cellular organisms that Eric had found. Fossilized, of course. They very well could have been early Proterozoic, or even late or mid-Archean in age. To confirm this, however, I needed to get a date on them. Before anything else could be said, the lights flickered. "Oh, don't worry about that." Eric didn't seem fazed by the issue. "This has been happening for a while now, probably some bug in the electrical system." "Well, alright then. I should be able to radiometrically date it sometime tomorrow. In the meantime, best we head outside to check on the weather station. A big storm's supposed to come by later tonight. There's a chance of it being Condition 1. You see, weather in Antarctica is categorized by its severity. Condition 3 is normal, non-lethal weather. Condition 2 is when things start to get dangerous. Visibility starts to fade and wind speed increases. Finally, there's Condition 1, which consists of the worst possible weather conditions and can involve wind speeds greater than about 63 miles per hour and wind chills colder than -100 degrees Fahrenheit or visibility less than 100 feet. Since this location has been recorded as the coldest place on the entire planet, it was frightening to think just how violent a storm here could get. Eric led us back through the hallway to the front entrance. When we got back out, I once more was invested in the panoramic view of the frozen plateau around us. Endless plains of snow stretched outward in every direction for miles. And if I'm honest, it was quite an eye-catching sight. Out in the distance was the station, a tall antenna against the polar backdrop. Automated weather stations have multiple different sensors that measure temperature, wind speed and direction, relative humidity, and pressure. Around 300 feet away was a small elevated shack, most likely a radio or communications center of some sort. Eric walked up to the station, checking for any signs of weather that would approach. After he analyzed it, he turned to us with an expression of concern. "Unfortunately, it looks like I was right. We have a Condition 1 sweeping through here tonight." Condition 1 being the most violent type of weather could easily cause a fatality if one were exposed to it. "Come on, we better head back and lock up for the night." Ellen and I followed Eric back to the facility. As we did, something off in the distance caught my eye. I had noticed a weirdly shaped pattern, or some kind of formation in the snow. Such things are a natural phenomenon, as the texture and appearance of the icy landscape is shaped by the strong winds of the region. Although something about them seemed rather interesting. It appeared to be serpentine in appearance. Could something like that have been formed merely by the wind? I stood there for a good few seconds, contemplating the issue. "What's wrong? You frozen?" I continued back to the facility at Ellen's response. Later that night, we had the facility in complete lockdown for our safety during the storm. The windows were completely engulfed in frost, and the rushing winds were loud enough to be heard from outside. Any living thing would be killed by that weather in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. We took that time to do some more digging in the quarry and collect some more samples for dating. The highest layer dated back to the late Proterozoic, more specifically, the Ediacaran period. The bottom of the quarry dated back to what we believe to be the mid or perhaps even early Archean. We managed to recover several Ediacaran fossils from the top of the quarry, specifically those of early sessile animal life, similar to modern sponges, coral, and anemones. They were surprisingly well preserved, some of them showing the insides of the organism. I also took some time to recover some rocks at the bottom of the quarry. I was hoping to get a date on them later during the week, but took one of them to the lab to have a more up-close look at it. Using specialized tech, I took a sample from the rock, placing the slice beneath the microscope lens. When I looked through, there were more microbic lifeforms similar to the ones I had seen on the previous fossil, but they seemed less pronounced. The best way to describe it is that other fossils were a more complex type of prokaryote, where these ones seemed slightly more primitive, perhaps even older in age. Without warning, the entire room began to shake. The lights once more flickered as well. This sent me into a state of shock. Then suddenly, it stopped. Some of the lab equipment had been tossed around, but luckily none of the fossils were damaged. I hurried out of the lab to make sure my colleagues were okay, and found them standing in the middle of the hallway. "Are you guys okay? What the hell just happened?" I honestly have no idea. It was like some sort of tremor. Alan seemed just as confused as I was. Eric too was trying to rationalize what had just happened. I don't recall this area being along any fault line, or even a cave system for that matter. Unable to make out what had just happened, we took time to settle down and return to what we were doing. Over the course of the week, more rocks and fossils were recovered. The organisms preserved ranged from Ediacaran fauna to some of the earliest known single-cellular life to have appeared on Earth. I was able to do some radiometric dating tests with some of the fossils that were recovered. The fossils that Eric had shown us upon arrival were earliest Proterozoic in age, specifically Siderian. Some of the others turned out to be late Archean. At the end of the week, I was awaiting results of one of the fossils I recovered from the quarry's deepest layers. Eric was monitoring the facility from the inside as we were in the midst of yet another Condition 1 storm. They're known this time of year for being particularly frequent. Alan was in the quarry, excavating for any more potential finds. I stopped for a second, noticing a tiny opening through the frost-engulfed windows. I could just make out the raging winds outside. While life is known for surviving in some extreme places, this place was apparently not one of them. Even the hardest of Antarctic life would freeze to death here. I walked on over to the lab to see if the test results for my rock had come back. When I came to check, they were in, the reveal of which made me gasp in disbelief. The fossil I had found, the one containing microbial life, was 3.8 billion years old. Specifically, the Eoarchaean. The oldest we knew prior was 3.5 billion. But this, what I was looking at, was without a doubt some of the oldest life to exist. Most likely the foremost oldest ever. I knew what I was looking at was a major find, and could be a vital contribution to our understanding of how life on Earth came to be. I was right about to go let Eric know. But then, it happened again. Another tremor started to shake the facility. The equipment started to jump around. Some of it was pushed off the table. I got out of the lab as soon as I could, but then realized Alan was still in the quarry. I ran over to the quarry entrance to go and get him out of there. As soon as I opened the doors, I had ran over to the site of the entire quarry collapsing, accompanied by Alan's muffled shout. Once again, the tremor came to a sudden stop. The entire quarry had somehow fallen, creating a pit that was at least 95 to 100 feet deep. As I was in the midst of panicking, I heard Alan's voice call out from the bottom.
"Hello? Is anybody there?"
As soon as I heard his voice, I called back to reassure him. "Don't worry, Alan. Stay right there. I'm gonna get help." I ran down to the hallway to find Eric, and I nearly crashed into him. "What's going on? What the hell just happened?" "It's Alan. He was in the quarry, and it collapsed. He's still alive though." "Shit. Come on, we need to get down there and recover him. Now!" Eric and I rushed to a storage room where emergency equipment was kept. We grabbed a rope, harness, and some climbing gear and quickly made our way back to what remained of the quarry. When we got there, I called out to once more reassure Alan. "Is everything okay? We're coming right down." However, there was no reply. My fears began to worsen, as I wasn't sure if Alan was okay or not. Without any more hesitation, Eric had the ropes anchored to the ground. We attached harnesses to ourselves and slowly made our way down into the pit. As we descended, the light from above became dimmer. Everything around us began to get darker. Once we reached the bottom, we switched on our flashlights and searched for Alan. He was nowhere to be seen. Then the beam of my light caught a trail of blood. My heart began to race, as there was no telling what happened to Alan. Eric took notice and tried to reassure me. "Get it together. We don't know what happened to him." Our flashlight beams then shined in the direction of the trail of blood and revealed a massive cave, at least 15 feet in diameter. Neither of us had any time to question it and went through. However, something about it didn't seem right. The cave didn't seem like the product of erosion. In fact, there were signs that suggested that this was a recent formation, like something that was made yesterday. Suddenly, we came to a stop as the cave forked in two directions. It became clear to me that this cave system wasn't carved out by water or erosion. These were tunnels. But there was no way that was possible. No living thing could survive here. We continued to follow the trail of blood when Eric came to a complete halt. Before I had a chance to say anything, a sound started emanating from around the corner. It resembled a sort of skittering. As it gradually got louder, neither of us made so much as a move, both completely paralyzed. Around the corner came some creature. It was at least 4 feet in length, and it most closely resembled a velvet worm, only much larger. It slowly traversed through the tunnel on its dozens of tiny legs, not seeming to notice us. This changed everything we knew. Nothing is supposed to be capable of living in this area of the continent. Yet, there was life, right before our eyes. "Tell me you just saw that." Eric looked at me. "That was real. There's no mistake." Perhaps the subterranean temperatures here are lower than on the surface. However life can and is surviving down here just wasn't clear to either of us. Eric and I continued down the left tunnel, following the trail. Could something have created these tunnels? Maybe those velvet worm-type creatures had created them, and their tunneling caused the quarry to cave in. Yet, the one we saw was merely 4 feet. Was it even possible for something that small to make a tunnel of that size? The walls of the tunnel began to show small glowing dots. As Eric and I got closer, it became more obvious. The tunnel was lined with numerous bioluminescent fungi. There was so much of it that we didn't need our flashlights as much. At the end of the tunnel, we heard a faint coughing coming from around the corner. It had to be Alan, and with haste, Eric and I went as fast as we could. Making a sharp right, we arrived in a large chamber, the roof littered with thousands of bioluminescent fungi we had seen in the previous tunnel, which created enough light for us to see what was in front of us. And what we saw was Alan badly injured and lying on the ground. Eric and I rushed over to help. On the ground next to him, there were several worms like the one we had seen earlier. One of them was on top of him, presumably trying to feed on him. Eric quickly grabbed it and pulled it off and threw it to the side, where it proceeded to scurry away. Alan was barely breathing and appeared to be coughing up blood. We needed to get him back up to the facility as soon as we could. As Eric and I helped him up, he was trying to say something, but I could hardly make it out. "What? There. Here. Don't try to talk. We're gonna get you back." Eric and I made our way back to the tunnel, with Alan on our shoulders. He was capable of walking, but just barely. As we did, everything began to shake. As another tremor began, a deep, booming bellow came through, the sound echoing off the icy walls. When this happened, all the worms in the chamber began to bolt in all directions, scurrying as if they were deeply afraid of something. "The tunnels must be caving. We need to hurry." Hearing what Eric said, the two of us rushed to the best of our ability through the tunnels, carrying Alan on each of our shoulders, all while I carried a flashlight in my other hand. We kept meandering through the tunnels until we reached a dead end. The tunnel opening leading from the pit that was once the quarry had collapsed entirely. No. I started to panic, not knowing how to handle the situation. The fact that we were potentially trapped down here had sent me into hysteria. Once more, the tunnel shook. The three of us nearly fell over, but managed to stay up. The shaking then suddenly halted. Everything around us went quiet. A skittering noise became audible. We turned around to see yet another worm crawling around the corner. Without any warning, bam! The wall of the tunnel bursted open, revealing a massive creature. It grabbed the worm in its mouth, scarfing it down in seconds. This thing, whatever it was the size of an elephant and resembled some demented, hellish version of a naked mole rat. Only with fur, tusks protruded from the sides of its mouth, and its forelimbs were equipped with massive claws, each as long as they were tall. It became clear to me that this was what made the tunnels
and caused the quarry to collapse. The worms were merely its food source. None of us made any sudden moves. Suddenly though, Alan slipped, nearly losing his footing. Eric and I caught him, but the creature's attention shifted toward us. While it was clearly blind and not looking directly at us, it sniffed the air repeatedly with its massive, vertical nostrils. Apparently, they hunt by both scent and sound. All three of us stood still and completely silent, not wanting to draw out its attention anymore. As it continued to try and pick up our scent, behind us, the ground exploded as another one came out from beneath. Before we could do anything, it grabbed Alan in its jaws, retreating back into the hole it came out of. The echo of Alan's scream could be heard as it slowly faded down the hole. The other creature let out a deep walrus-like roar. As it charged, Eric and I managed to leap out of the way and dodge it, causing it to crash into the wall. The two of us ran as fast as we could, with the beam from our flashlights and the wall fungi being the only thing allowing us to see. The tunnels began to randomly shake, signaling the presence of more creatures. Within minutes, we once more reached the chamber where we had found Alan. There seemed to be no way out. What the hell do we do now? Eric started to panic this time, him just being as equally fearful for our lives as I was. I can't fucking die here. I can't. The wall of the chamber bursted as another one of those creatures came through. Eric and I immediately froze. It started to try and pick up our scents while it slowly traversed around the room. If either of us so much as gasped, it would lock onto our location. Our attentions turned to the tunnel it emerged from. We didn't know where it would lead, but we had to just go and take that chance. We quietly crept along the side of the chamber. As slow as it was possible to go, the creature was on the opposite side, continuing to try and lock onto us. Both of us were just barely managing to hold our breath. Finally, we managed to reach the entrance of the tunnel, but out of nowhere, one of the worms darted out from the dark and through Eric's legs, causing him to fall over. This, of course, caught the creature's attention. Before it could charge, Eric got up and we began to run through the tunnel. As we ran for our lives, the tunnel became steeper. As we ran up through, we became more and more breathless. Another left turn was visible through the ascending tunnel, and around it appeared a faint, dim light. Without questioning it in the slightest, our choice of action was to run right to it. When we reached the source, what we encountered was an icy rock wall, nearly vertical, and an opening to the surface at the top. We have to climb it. Now! Are you out of your damn mind? Another one of the creature's roars echoed throughout the cave, forcing Eric to agree to the option. The Condition 1 storm was most likely still in a violent state, but at the moment, we didn't have a choice. Eric and I began making our way up. Luckily, the two of us both had an ice axe on us in the worst case scenario. As fast as we could, we dug our axes into the frozen wall of rock, making our ascent to the opening. Once we made it 3/4 of the way up, the creature was below us, making an effort to pursue us upward. This forced us to climb even faster. Both of us were on overdrive, practically clawing our way up. Finally, we reached the opening. I managed to squeeze myself through, and was greeted by a rush of violent wind. I was literally 18 feet away from the facility station. In spite of the violent weather, I turned to help Eric, who had managed to squeeze half of his body through the opening. I grabbed his hands and started pulling him out. Just as I almost had him out, however, he was dragged right back through and pulled out of my hands. His scream echoed in unison with the creature's roar as the opening proceeded to collapse. No! I got down on the ground, clawing and digging at the collapsed opening. No. I finally gave up and hung my head down in regret as I began to weep. However, the ground had once again started shaking, but was accompanied by the sound of the facility falling apart. I looked up and saw the entire facility built around the quarry beginning to cave in and collapse. Within seconds, the entire building came down. All that remained now was the weather station, the small shack from before off in the distance. I knew now that my only hope for survival was to radio somebody, hoping that it would be picked up on. Against the violent winds, I made every effort to get to the shack, only illuminated by a faint light. As violent 60-mile-per-hour winds crashed into me, I was nearly blown off of my feet. After traversing through the storm, I dragged myself up the stairs and made my way into the shack, slamming the door behind me. As I thought, the shack was a radio and communications building. I immediately proceeded to send a transmission, stating I was in distress. Halfway through, however, the last of my energy was expended, and I collapsed, passing out completely. When I woke, I was in the medical room, laid down on a bed. A doctor came in, telling me that I'm on a boat headed for Dunedin, New Zealand. They proceeded to explain how I was out for 3 days, and how I had nearly died, although I still sustained minimal frostbite. Once we reached Dunedin, I was transferred to a hospital where I spent the next week and a half recovering from my injuries. The report by the RNZN stated that 2 members of the expedition were dead, most likely killed by the collapse of the facility, although their bodies were unable to have been recovered. I was found unconscious and in a coma in a small radio station where I was quickly airlifted to safety. Part of me wanted to tell them about what I had seen, but I knew how things like that ended. Nobody in their right mind would take such an account seriously. Much later on, I had hoped that this would be buried by the passage of time. This ordeal forced me into months of therapy. I didn't even get sleep for a while. Even when I was able to move on, it remained in the back of my mind. Now, it's been quite relevant in my mind again. Several months ago, I had received a strange email, one with no sender, where all it contained was an image link. My first thought was that this was spam, but there was no text, just that link. Reluctantly, I clicked it. All that was there was an image with white text that just said, "Dr. Carter, we are aware of the ordeal you had faced. It must be very difficult, seeing as not a soul would believe your words. We know what you saw though. We know what you experienced. There is still so much about our planet the public doesn't know. And you, Doctor, have only scratched the surface. TEF." My first thoughts were that this was a weird conspiracy group, one that had no idea what they were talking about, or perhaps some practical joke. Although, why would the email have no sender, yet just contain that link? It's clear this wasn't spam. But who the bloody fuck was TEF? Whoever they were, there's one thing they're right about. After everything I saw, I can safely confirm that we as a species think we know all there is. But in reality, we know practically nothing.